Mr. Goble, it's great to see you in our studio here at VOA.
Thank you for having me.
Mr. Goble, you're a longtime observer of Russia, and you have been following the events in Ukraine, in Crimea. How would you characterize what's taking place in that part of the world? Are we seeing a new kind of world order? Are we entering a new era?
What Vladimir Putin has done in Crimea by annexing it to the Russian Federation through the use of force is the most dangerous of development in the international system since World War II. It calls into question the settlement of 1945 and the settlement of 1991 because it suggests that there are governments out there, in the first instance that of the Russian Federation, that are prepared to use force to revise borders, which puts the entire international system at risk, and which elevate ethnicity over citizenship. Vladimir Putin has asserted that being an ethnic Russian is more important than being a citizen of Ukraine. If you make that kind of argument, you call into question any possibility for stability in the international system, and you set the stage for not a new world order, but a disorder that will undoubtedly cost the lives of thousands, if not more, people, and will leave everyone less secure than they were the day before the Russian Federation annexed Crimea.
Mr. Goble, there are those in the West who are saying that maybe the United States pushed Russia too hard in the aftermath of the Cold War. Maybe it was treated unfairly, or the fact that Crimea used to be a part of Russia. How would you respond to those kind of arguments?
Well, first off, the borders that existed in the Soviet Union were not ideal borders in the sense that they were not developed by the peoples themselves. They were imposed from above by Moscow. Those borders were drawn by Stalin, and in the case of Crimea, it was transferred from the Russian Federation to the Ukraine in 1954 by Nikita Khrushchev on the basis of a plan that Stalin had worked out. So the idea that we're talking about borders that are immemorial and somehow morally justified is problematic. On the other hand, a decision was made by the international community in 1992, reflected in a statement by the United States White House on February 6, 1992, that the borders, the administrative borders, which were created by Stalin for within the Soviet Union, were to become recognized, internationally recognized interstate borders, because doing anything else would set the stage for violence and clashes forever and ever. As to the question of whether the United States pushed the Russians too hard after 1991, I don't even know what that means. There was a geopolitical competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union lost. The fact is the United States did not dictate the outcomes. The fact is the United States did not impose very much on Russia. The Russian government and the Russian people were allowed to do a lot of things which it would have been far better if they hadn't, both Chechen wars, a lot of human rights abuses, and so forth. So the idea that Russia is somehow entitled to behave this way is not justified by history in terms of to whom Crimea somehow supposedly belongs. If it belongs to anyone, it belongs to the Crimean Tatars, who are now being subjected to ethnic cleansing by Russian forces. It certainly doesn't belong to the Russian state, as Vladimir Putin has insisted. This is a very dangerous development, one that we should all be very afraid of, and the fact that Russian propaganda and the sympathy that has in some circles in the West is claiming that somehow it's the Americans' fault should be treated for what it is, a simple projection of the problems of that country onto everyone else.
People say that Ukraine has lost Crimea forever. My question is different. Is Ukraine lost for Russia forever?
Yes, yes. The Russian government, Vladimir Putin, has achieved something that no Russian government or Russian ruler in history has. It has taken the Ukrainian people and converted them from a people, most of whom were pretty sympathetic to the Russians, who felt they shared many aspects of a common culture, and converted them into a nation which is now more anti-Russian and anti-Moscow than even Poland. The Russian government may have occupied Crimea, but it has lost Ukraine. And it has lost Ukraine forever, as far as I can see. The Poles will never forget what was done to them in 1863 and later in Katyn Forest and so on. I think that no Ukrainian will ever forget the occupation of Crimea by the Russian government and by Vladimir Putin personally. And this is something that I believe will eventually come back to haunt Moscow and the Russian Federation. Indeed, I believe that by his actions in Crimea, Vladimir Putin has set in train an acceleration of the forces that are going to tear the Russian Federation apart. Not this week or next, but over the next months or years. This is an incredibly dangerous thing he has done. Can we force him to reverse it? Probably not, no matter what we do. Do we need to register with the international community just how wrong this is by having serious sanctions, serious penalties imposed on the Russian state for what Vladimir Putin has done? Absolutely. It is a moral requirement that we do so. As the great Russian memoirist Nadezhda Mandelstam put it, happy is that country in which the despicable will at least be despised. We may not be able to force Putin to back up, but we must make it very clear that what he has done is despicable and puts him outside of the comity of nations who are committed to the principles of the United Nations Charter and to stability and peace in the world.
How should the nations who belong to the Guam bloc, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, and Azerbaijan, and I include Ukraine, respond to what's taking place?
Well, I think it's worth noting that Georgia withdrew from the Commonwealth of Independent States after Russia occupied part of its territory in August 2008. The Ukrainian government has signaled that it is withdrawing from the Commonwealth of Independent States. I would hope that Moldova and Azerbaijan would follow suit. If that happens, the Russian government will be sent a very important signal that while it may have occupied a peninsula in the Black Sea, the cost to it and its relations with its neighbors is so high that it should reconsider doing anything more in this direction, even if it proves incapable of backing down from an act of aggression.
What is your assessment of the West's, in particular the United States' reaction to what has been taking place in Crimea?
I fear three things. First, I fear that people are viewing this much too narrowly, that they've allowed Moscow to define the issue and treat Crimea as some kind of special case, rather than seeing it as a much bigger and more general threat to the international system. Second, I believe that the Western countries, and especially the United States, have taken the position that because we can't reverse what Moscow has done, and there really is no way, not even using enormous military power, to reverse the Russian occupation of Crimea. The Russians don't choose to do it themselves. The view is, if we can't force them to reverse, then imposing sanctions and doing other things, we shouldn't go very far because it's counterproductive. It doesn't achieve anything. There's a failure to recognize, it seems to me, how important it is to make it very clear that what Moscow has done, what Mr. Putin has done, is a crime, a violation of the international order, and it's something that the United States and its partners in Europe are not going to sit still for. The third element, which I think is very dangerous, is that the Russian government has presented itself in recent years as a partner of the United States in dealing with international terrorism, in dealing with Iran, and so forth. I think there are all too many people who think that that partnership is somehow so valuable that we mustn't push Russia very hard. That's certainly an argument you'll hear from Russian commentators. Tragically, you hear it from some American commentators. I think they're wrong. I think the Russian government has behaved in a way that calls into question any possibility that it can be an honest partner of the international community on any subject whatsoever. This is a major, major violation of the international system and the international order. And even if we can't reverse it, we have to make that crystal clear, not only to Russians other than Vladimir Putin, who may not be capable of learning, but also to other countries like China, like Iran, like any country that may be thinking that it can invoke ethnicity as more important than citizenship and act against its neighbors through the use of military force. That's something we have fought a couple of world wars to counter. That's something we have made very clear in the United Nations Charter. That's something that we declared very clearly was part of the 1991 settlement. Consequently, by violating all of those things, the Russian government of Vladimir Putin has put itself outside of the comity of nations, and that needs to be made very clear. Russians need to understand what their president has done for them, because it is not to their benefit either. And I believe that Vladimir Putin thinks he is going to go down in history as the greatest ingatherer of Russian lands of all time. I think he's going to be remembered as the man who, by his incautious policies, has accelerated the final disintegration of the Russian state and the emergence on the territory of that state of a large number of much smaller countries, many of which will end up hating Moscow far more than would ever have been the case had the Russians not used military force in Crimea.